Hey everyone, Tankenstein here. In this video, I'll be giving you your complete MiG-23 and MiG-27 air combat and dogfighting guide for WarThunder. I'll be going over a ton in this video, including major differences between the MiG-23s and MiG-27s, as well as the major differences between the variants therein, do's and don'ts for both of these planes, their strengths and weaknesses, tips and how to play these vehicles, the missile variations that they can carry, and when to use each type of missile, the best modules to grind first, most important crew skills, and some final advice. While this will be primarily for air RB and air cover and ground RB, you can still take the lessons applied and, for the most part, successfully transfer them to air AB, if that's what you play. But I will still be exclusively showing air RB in this video. Even as new MiG-23s and MiG-27s come into WarThunder, the tactics will not change much, as we have already had the MiG-23 MLD, of which is the most advanced variant of the MiG-23, and the MiG-27K, of which is the most advanced Soviet version of the MiG-27, meaning that regardless of the few variants that join WarThunder in the future, this guide will still hold true. As you can tell, I wanted this guide to focus on air-to-air combat, so ground attack will not be covered in this guide, largely because I wanted to focus this guide to be both concise and to speak to the type of gameplay that most MiG-23 and even MiG-27 players participate in. First, for the MiG-23s, we currently have the MiG-23M, MiG-23 MF, which is the export version of the M that currently sits as an event vehicle in the German air tech tree, and the MiG-23 MLD. The MiG-27s in-game are the MiG-27M and the MiG-27K. With the exception of the MiG-23 MF, all aforementioned MiG-23s and MiG-27s are currently in the Russian air tech tree, although Germany is likely to receive the MiG-23 ML in the near future. Now, for similarities and differences, I'll use the MiG-23M as the base point of comparison. Now, as you can see here on the side, I've listed the stats for the MiG-23M via the stat card in-game, with the exception of an approximately 1 second longer turn and 15.3 meters per second lower rate of climb. The MiG-27M and K have about the same performance as the MiG-23M and MF, the latter of which are again essentially identical. Now, once the ML comes to game, it will have similar performance to the MLD, so you can just figure that in when you're looking at this guide. Now, that said, the only difference between the Russian M and the German MF is that the MF has access to R-60MK missiles, rather than what you see on the Russian tech tree with the R-60Ms. The only difference between these two missiles is that the MK has a radar fuse, whereas the M has a proximity fuse, though I do not know if this is modeled in-game. If it is, it certainly does not affect performance. Aside from this, the MLD is where things start getting wild, so I'll go over the major differences between all the variants now. Now, the MiG-23M, MF, MiG-27M, and MiG-27K all share essentially the same engine, although the MiG-27s feature the R29B300 engine as opposed to the R29300 engine in the MiG-23M and MF, which gives the 27s about 2% less thrust when using afterburners. Now, the MLD, however, uses the R35300, which, although it shows as having less thrust and about the same afterburner thrust as the other engines, propels the MLD to a nearly 220 meter per second rate of climb, which is about 55 meters per second faster than the MiG-23M and MF, and nearly 70 meters per second than the MiG-27s. Now, the MiG-27s have far more countermeasures, with 72 compared to the 12 in the 23M and MF, although the MLD also has 72 countermeasures. To carry on with some of the differences between the 23s and the 27s, the 23s can carry both more missiles and have a greater variety of missiles that they can carry, whereas MiG-27s are far more capable against ground targets. This includes the longer range R-23 missiles on the MiG-23s, with the MLD being able to carry the R-24s, which have a 50-kilometer launch range. Outside of the aforementioned performance boost with the engine, of which again gives a ridiculous rate of climb in the MLD, as well as the better mid-range missiles, the MLD performs about the same as the other MiG-23s, with the same turn time and about the same top speed, with the MiG-27s, of course, being just about the same as well. Now, really, the biggest differences between these planes, specifically the MiG-27 compared to the 23, is essentially that the 27 is a ground attack plane, with full ballistics computers being built in for both bombs and rockets, as well as a much larger dedicated anti-ground ordnance suite being available, with missiles being optional on most loadouts, making the MiG-27s excellent at both air cover and close air support if playing ground RB, whereas the MiG-23s, regardless of the variant, are more or less stuck in the anti-air role. Now, MiG-27s also carry the 30mm GSH-630 cannon, with 300 rounds of ammunition, compared to the MiG-23 that only has the 23mm GSH-23L cannon, with 200 rounds of ammunition. Clearly, in this case, the MiG-27 will have the better and more capable cannon, both for anti-ground and anti-air duties. Even more, the burst mass of the MiG-27's cannon is 32.36 kilograms per second, compared to 9.91 kilograms per second second on the MiG-23, coming entirely from both the larger size of the ammunition and the much higher rate of fire with the 30mm at 5,000 rounds per minute compared to 3,400 rounds per minute on the MiG-23s. And now let's get into the strengths and weaknesses for the MiG-23s and 27s, and these will be general strengths and weaknesses, although when I do specify if it's a MiG-23 or a 27 or a specific variant, I will definitely let you know. So first and foremost, a general strength is that they all have incredible speed and rate of climb, both of which are greatly aided by the variable wing design. Secondly, they have incredibly powerful suites of air-to-air weaponry, being highlighted by R60s and on the MLD, the R24s as well. As mentioned before, the MiG-23s do get to carry 2 more missiles, however, you do still get the R60s, 4 of them on the MiG-27s. Now, compared to other MiGs, the 23s and 27s both have excellent cannons and ammunition amounts, with the MiG-27 being the king here, with again a 30mm cannon that has 300 rounds of ammunition, although it does go through that very quickly. Now fourth, the MiG-23 MLD and MiG-27s all have 72 flares, which is about as good as you can get around this BR. And finally, they all have decent to good survivability when hit, although in my experience, the MiG-27 definitely feels better in this regard, as I've flown back to base with half a wing. Now for weaknesses, while it can be beneficial, the manual wing sweep controls are not precise enough where most people can use this effectively in most combat situations. Basically what I mean is that you have to be really good at multitasking to be great at doing this. To this point, the wings are fairly breakable when not swept back, so you really have to make sure that they are at proper wing sweep, depending on the speed of course that you're moving. Now secondly, they only have 12 flares on the MiG-23M and MF. And third, while maneuverability is decent for a plane of its size and weight, it will still be easily outturned by F5s, MiG-21s, and even some F4s, depending of course on the pilot. And now finally, for some tips and how to play. So first, when in the initial stages of a match, try not to climb too high, such as 5,000 meters, as that will leave you to be a sitting target for Sparrow missiles. Rather, try to keep between 2,000 and 4,000 meters, which will provide the best mixture of safety, performance, and weapons capability, especially if you're using the R23 or R24 missiles for longer range. After the initial melee, you can certainly climb up to space, so to speak, as this is one of the greatest strengths of both the MiG-23s and MiG-27s. They dominate at high altitude more than any aircraft currently in game, although this will change once we get into more modern fighters. Now secondly, I'll say this numerous times throughout the video, but prioritize missile upgrades over everything else, at least until you have access to the R60s. Now while the R13s are certainly good, the R60s are amazing and will result in more kills per match than any other upgrade that you can purchase for the MiG. So it doesn't matter if it's the G-suit, it doesn't matter if it's the engine, wing upgrade, or whatever. With the exception of countermeasures, the R60s will be the biggest upgrade that you can get. For the third tip and, well, how to play, if in Air RB, try not to bring anything except for your missiles of choice. You can be silly and bring extra cannons if your plane of course supports them, such as on the MLD and the MiG-27s, but this is not advised, as air combat at this BR, at least when in Air RB, is really just too fast and at too long of a range for these to be reliable options. Bringing missiles only are a much better option than bringing anti-ground ordnance such as bombs or again those cannons, as they will only slow you down and lead to a much lower score per game average than if you just stick with only missiles alone. Now fourth, even if you don't use them throughout a match, using manual controls to swing your wings back can give you better acceleration in the opening portions of a match. Importantly, wing sweep affects the following aspects of flight in WarThunder. Now first, and probably foremost, it affects roll rate greatly. This is a very noticeable difference. Secondly, it affects acceleration slightly. Third, your variable wing sweep angle affects top speed, at least moderately, and again in terms of usable top speed. So what I mean is that it's not necessarily going to impact you so much because normal combat speeds are not going to be the exact top speed of your vehicle, but rather it could impact you when going to 14 or 1500 kilometers per hour if you're really starting to gain speed. Now fourth, it affects maneuverability greatly, because if you have your wings swept out, typically you will have a greater amount of maneuverability. But of course, you have to watch out for the next thing. What I mean by that is wing break speed, and having your wings unswept is a great way to have your wings destroyed at higher speeds, especially if you are going up and down. And I've experienced this several times, especially a few months ago when I was first starting to learn the MiG-23s, is that if you go down and your wings are out, then you will probably tear off a wing. And finally, we should all know this, wing sweep affects how cool you look to a great extent. Now for the fifth tip, and again, how to play. Learn when to run and when to fight. If being chased by, for example, an F5 or even a MiG-21, you should be able to outrun them at all altitudes. Unless they already have a speed advantage, don't try to turn back for them until you know that they've broken off pursuit. If they insist on continually following you, simply head back to base for a resupply. If they're still chasing you, you can just let your base AA pick them off. And finally, when using radar guided missiles, you should try to sit at between 25 and 3,500 meters, as this will allow you to more easily target planes above you, which will result in a more likely lock and hit with your missile. If you need to increase altitude, no need to worry, as the MiG-23s and 27s have such a ridiculous rate of climb that it's really just a guarantee that you can climb faster than almost anyone else, regardless of the variant used, but especially with the MLD. And now this part is extremely important, and these are the differences between the missile types and when exactly to use them. Now, before I get into this, I want to clarify the term for you, all aspect, as it is an extremely important part of discussing missiles in War Thunder, and because it's something that, quite honestly, no one explained to me until I found out the hard way. Now, all aspect means that a missile can target an enemy, regardless of if they're facing you or going away from you, or if you're on the side of them, above them, below, whatever. Simply put, whereas less advanced IR or infrared guided missiles essentially need for you to be behind the enemy for a lock to occur, all aspect missiles do not need that. Radar guided missiles are all aspect, with more advanced IR guided missiles being all aspect, albeit typically at a decreased range. For example, the R-23T can lock onto a target from 15 kilometers away when facing its rear, but only 2.3 kilometers when the target is facing you. With this said, let's get into the missiles themselves, and for the R-35s, these are going to be your basic missiles, and it's going to be unanimously the worst missile that you can attach to these planes. While it has a launch range 1 kilometer longer than the R-60, it has a 0.8 Mach lower top speed, 20 Gs less of maneuverability, and 3 Gs less of launch overload. The only real way where it's substantially better is in the explosive filler, but this is inconsequential, as you will basically need an enemy to be flying straight or very slow in order for your R-35s to hit them. It is imperative that you grind your way to the R-13s as your first goal, unless of course you really want to just protect yourself a little bit more and get the chaff and countermeasures, but really I would say the R-13s typically should be your first goal. Now, speaking of, the R-13 is not just the next step in missiles, but it's more so a huge leap in missile capabilities, with some people actually preferring these over the R-60s, although those people are few and far between. This is not to say that the R-13s are not good, however, as they boast a 16 kilometer launch range, Mach 2.4 top speed, 20 Gs of tracking overload, and 6 Gs of launch overload, along with 5.5 kilograms of explosive filler and a massive 54 seconds of guidance time, which is about 2.5 times what the R-60 has. This is a great solution if you find yourself trailing enemies often and want something with more range than the R-60. In that regard, the R-60 is not a direct upgrade to the R-13. Of course, it is an upgrade, although the R-13 does have some things that the R-60 simply cannot do. Now that said, with the R-60, it is the big kahuna. It is one of the best air-to-air missiles in all of War Thunder currently, as it has an absurd 30 Gs of overload with 7 Gs of launch overload and a very precise tracking system, meaning that even though it only has 1.15 kilograms of explosive filler, you will almost always get a kill, and even if you don't, you will typically severely damage your enemy, causing a crash soon thereafter. The hit probability on the R-60 is far greater than the R-35 and even the R-13, and the R-13 is a great missile. This will be your main goal when researching all MiG-23s and MiG-27s for air-to-air combat. And now finally, you have the R-23s and 24. Now these are special, medium-ish range missiles that can be launched from over 10 kilometers away and have a much greater amount of explosive filler, with over 20 kilograms being typical. The 23s differ from the 24s in that thus far the MLD is the only plane in game with the 24s, and that the 24s have a decently longer range, speed, guidance time, and G overload, making them a good bit more effective than the 23s at a range. In short, however, both missiles are marked with R and T, with T being thermal tracking or your standard infrared, which is what the R-35, 13, and 60 all use, with the R being radar guided, which requires a lock from your plane's radar to guide the missile to your opponent. The radar guided variants are longer range and are all aspect for a much longer range, meaning that you can target planes that are coming towards you from over 20 kilometers away and fire at them from about that distance, whereas the T variants will be able to lock on to an enemy from about that range, but only if you're on the rear of your enemy. Now this is useful in a chase scenario, but not too much else. They also have all aspect capabilities, but only at around 4.3 kilometers with the 24T and 2.3 kilometers with the 23T, which makes them very iffy to use in a head-on, especially when they are much better used when chasing an opponent at a range. And now for your do's and don'ts for the MiG-23s and 27s in air combat. And first and foremost, bring a minimum of 20 minutes of fuel. These planes planes are gas guzzlers. You will need at least that 20 minutes of fuel, because if you go in with the bare minimum, then you will be crashing shortly thereafter. Secondly, use your speed and acceleration to your advantage. Specifically, what I mean is much like what I had said before, if you are facing an enemy that could outturn you, like an F5, MiG-21, MiG-19, you name it, typically you will be able to outrun them. So even if they can outturn you, you can outrun them. Use that to your advantage. Especially late game, you want to use that speed, acceleration to your advantage, because you can outclimb, outdive, outperform pretty much every plane in game. So if you can outperform them, bring them to your house. Make them try to chase you, because they will not be able to catch you. Now third, make sure that you have the proper missiles for each map, especially considering the MiG-23s. As with some maps such as Spain, you might be able to benefit from longer range R-23s and R-24s, whereas other maps you might want to consider the R-60s or R-13s almost exclusively. Now for don't, this kind of again goes on to a point that I touched on numerous times in this video. Do not get into turn fights with F5s, MiGs with a lower number of you, ergo MiG-21s, 19s, etc., J-35s, J-37s, Harriers, J-7s, A-5Cs, Mirages, F-8s, and some F-4 Phantoms, depending on how confident you feel. Although they can certainly outturn you if they're smart enough and if your wings are not at optimal sweep. So just really make sure that you're not trying to enter into too many dogfights. Of course, if you're in a furball, maybe you're not going to be a target for an enemy, which means that maybe you could turn with some planes, but ultimately try to avoid turning fights. Now secondly, do not use more than 2 flares at once if you can help it, at least if you're using the MiG-23M or MF. And for the third don't, you could of course equip bombs to your planes, more specifically the MiG-27s, as those were designed more so again for ground attack and have a much greater ability to carry ordnance, but doing so is a good way to get yourself killed. Rather, when trying to use the MiG-23 or MiG-27 in air RB, just bring missiles, as equipping bombs will severely hinder your performance and will lead to a much greater chance of you dying. Plus, it will distract you from shooting down enemy planes, which is really your main goal with these planes. Now let's get into cruise skills. So first and foremost, prioritize G tolerance and stamina first, with vitality being secondary. I cannot tell you how many times I've been chasing an opponent, and because I had either forgotten to use my several hundred cruise skill points, or because I wouldn't want to spend the GE to get more cruise skill points, my pilot became unconscious due to the G forces, whereas if he had not become unconscious, I would have had an easy kill against an opponent. And now let's get into modules, and I know that the cruise skills portion was very short, but realistically speaking, once you prioritize G tolerance, stamina, and then vitality, keen vision and awareness are also very important. But realistically speaking, I mean, planes are not nearly as crazy to upgrade for crew as tanks are, so just kind of those 3 points being your main, with keen vision, awareness being also up there as well. Now for modules, first and foremost, for every MiG-23 and MiG-27, especially if you're looking to prioritize air combat, you need to make your way down the missile tech tree as a priority. This is extremely important. The stock R-35s are not good, especially considering the speed and maneuverability of the aircraft that you'll be fighting. The R-13s are excellent, but the R-60s are going to be your main goal, the R-23s and R-24s being the icing on top, especially if you like the concept of longer than short range combat, if that makes any sense, because they aren't really long range missiles, but they're definitely not short range. I'd say medium, but some people on YouTube might yell at me for that. Now, aside from this, you can certainly go for countermeasures. That is definitely an option, but personally for me, I would go for missiles before I'd go for countermeasures, just because more often than not, I'm finding myself firing the missiles than having missiles fired at me. But after you get the missiles and the countermeasures, I would definitely go for performance upgrades. So by the time that you're able to go down to the bottom of the thing, you should be able to get the engine unlock. I'd go for that. Get the G suit, maybe even before the engine. But realistically speaking, just go for whatever gives you the best rate of climb and top speed, and kind of base it on that, and then go for ground ordnance for the last thing, especially at least if you are going to be focusing again on air RB, and just kind of don't really care so much about ground RB. And now with all this out of the way, first I just want to say I expected this video to be about 10 minutes shorter, but of course I am a loudmouth. So for the final advice, the stock grind for all MiG-23s and MiG-27s sucks. Playing at that high of a BR with only R-35s is brutal, but the payoff, in my opinion, is worth it. Always play to your strengths and try to minimize your weaknesses, as this is not a jack of all trades plane. Rather, it has excellent speed and acceleration, but mediocre maneuverability, as this was designed as an interceptor/fighter, meaning that speed was a primary goal, with maneuverability being a secondary concern. Actually, fun fact, if I'm not mistaken, they expected this plane in real life to be a much more maneuverable plane, but it came out to not really be all that great when it comes to maneuverability. Now, in this regard, using hit and run or boom and zoom tactics on an enemy may be your most effective usage of the 23 or 27, as you can swoop down at any given time and wipe out your enemies with R60s, all while speeding away at over Mach 1 while enemies struggle to keep pace or are simply blown away. Doing this several times while importantly bringing at least 20 minutes of fuel, again that is extremely important, at least 20 minutes of fuel, should ensure that most matches, even with basic R35s, should be fairly successful. Ultimately, it is important to get used to the cannon during the initial grind before you reach the R13s, so you may want to fly in test drive mode in order to master it, or you can simply buy the more advanced missiles with GE. Alternatively, during the grind, you can certainly go for NPC ground targets that are unarmored with the gun. That is also a great way to get yourself some RP so you can unlock those missiles. Now, for an idea of just how important this upgrade is, it is a far bigger upgrade than even when going from Heat FS to APF SDS in top tier ground battles. So what I mean is getting out of the R35 bracket is a bigger deal than going from Heat FS to APF SDS. Trust me, it's huge. Either way, for my closing statement, just be patient and act like a scavenger, as you should have mounting success with these underappreciated planes. And by underappreciated, I mean, and I've said it before, is that noobs will hate these planes, but if you're an old timer, you're gonna love them. So that said, thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And if you would, let me know what you thought about this video. I wanted to make a different type of vehicle guide than what I'm used to making, as this is my first specific vehicle plane guide. Either way, thanks again, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you all on the other side. Take care, everyone.
Lance, hello.